Yeah, we're not going to start in Ukraine because the first thing that struck me this week was the head of the British military, Admiral Radakin, has been criticised for visiting China. Sir Tony Radakin's trip marked the first time in 10 years that a UK official of his rank has gone to Beijing um, uh, to present to one of their defence colleges, but supposedly for talks. Sir Tony and members of China's Central Military Commission discussed issues of common concern during the visit on Wednesday, according to the country's defense ministry. What do you make of that? Especially the fact that the Chinese put out comment on it before we'd heard anything from the UK Minister of Defense.
Well, I've thought long and hard about this, Philip, and I suppose if I have one criticism, I think in with such a sensitive issue, it would have been nice if we were told that this meeting was going ahead. But I would disagree with Sir Ian Duncan Smith, who I think said that this was tantamount to appeasement. We don't know exactly what was discussed, nor necessarily should we. Appeasement requires certain actions. The world is in a arguably a more perilous place than it's been in for 80 years. The fact that at senior military level, Britain should be having discussions with China. I'm all in favor of that. Now, as I say, I will hold my counsel on that. My one criticism is with something that is going to be as sensitive as this, we should have been told. There should have been a little bit more transparency. But do we need to know exactly what was discussed? No. And I think you, as a former intelligence officer, will appreciate that better than I or most people.
Yeah, but again, nation domain. The Chinese took the initiative and can control the narrative that therefore gets out to the world. And this is where the Minister of Defence should have had an information plan behind the visit, knowing full well that something would come out so that they could dictate what happened. And to my mind, the visit's one of three things. One of them is extremely worrying. The first one is, really simply, Radakin's coming to the end of his time. He's always wanted to go to China, and his ego's got the better of him. And he's said to his team, "Get me to China and go in there. Oh, keep it quiet because things aren't too hot between us and the Chinese at the moment." If he's done that, I'm really, really worried. The second thing is, almost certainly what the rationale behind the meeting was. It's the old saying. Keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. And him trying to build up that relationship. But I think that ties in with the extremely worrying bit. It's the sort of thing where you send a chief of defense in to sit down with the Chinese chief of defense and say, "We know you're ready to take Taiwan. Don't dare do it." And it's a face-to-face threat. And if he's had to go in to do a face-to-face warning and threat on that, it means the Chinese are on the brink of taking Taiwan. And that, given the wider geopolitical pressures that are on and all the rest of it, and the trade wars and everything else, that I would say is the most logical reason for him being there, because the others, timings, bits and pieces would just be so wrong. And if it was him representing not just the UK, but representing the wider coalition, NATO, but in particular the United States, because the United States wouldn't want to go and do that, but they'll send their closest military partner to do that, and that's him going in. And that's where, knowing the psychology of the Minister of Defence, that have wanted to keep everything totally quiet, not say anything at all. And just deny or bring out bland statements. And Radakin himself brought out a very bland statement on X just after it came out with
Yeah.
the Chinese. That worries me.
If I can just reiterate, Philip, I very much hope it's not the first. I defer to your analysis on the other two joined reasons, but I think what you and I agree on absolutely, and as a former government communicator, this government has got to get better at communicating, and especially around sensitive issues like this. They got this wrong communication wise.
Yeah, no, very, and we get it wrong consistently, and we have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Now, someone who gets his communications right is President Zelensky. and your China, and this is why we started with China. Your China seems to have popped up even more in Ukraine. President Zelensky says at least 155 Chinese citizens are fighting for Russia in the war. His comments come after two Chinese fighters were captured earlier this week, marking Kyiv's first official allegation that China was supplying Russia with manpower. Now, two people have been captured and an assessment of 155. It's a pretty exact number. What are your thoughts?
Well, as you know, Ukraine's intelligence service is very, very effective. And from the beginning of this, when other intelligence services were tending not to trust them, and I noticed that other intelligence services are coming closer and closer over a range of things, whether it's casualties or not. So, one, I trust the Ukrainian intelligence because actually I got to know some of those people when I worked for the foreign minister. Two, I think it's very, very worrying. I think, I saw something about ads in Russia actually specifically targeting Chinese citizens. Now, given the absolute lockdown on information that the Chinese state has, it is very, very unlikely that the Chinese state would be unaware that its citizens, even if not directly sponsored by the Chinese state, I think it's extremely unlikely the Chinese state would not be aware that it's a large number of its citizens were signing up to fight with Russia. Given we've believed for over a year that China has been providing lethal aid to Russia to use against Ukraine anyway. So, I just think it's very concerning. And I'm on Ukraine's side, not surprisingly.
Yeah, I find it interesting. I find the numbers very small. Am I surprised that there are Chinese fighting with the Russians? No, not in the slightest. I think there may be some individual Chinese citizens have signed up to go and fight. There are quite a number of them through Russia. They may have come from China, but that's not where I think these ones have come from. And hence why there's the 155, the very exact number. I would think that there are probably at least 10 times that, if not a lot more, Chinese citizens fighting for Russia. But I think this 155 possibly relates to a formal bunch of liaison staff that have been given from the Chinese military to be embedded at different levels of the Russian military to gain combat experience at different levels and in different disciplines. Because the one thing that the People's Liberation Army doesn't have, and they can't buy, and they can't manufacture, and they can't steal the intellectual property behind it to help them develop, is combat experience. They've got none. And therefore getting that realities of what it's like in conflict, whether it be on the front line, whether it be command in headquarters, whether it be planning, whether it be logistics, the only way to get around that is to embed staff into different levels to see that. And this is what I think has probably and most likely happened here. And two of them have been captured. And I think Zelensky coming out with the exact number is whether it's come from just purely the Ukrainian intelligence or Western intelligence has fed that to him so that it can be released as a warning to China to say, we know exactly what you're up to. And this is something that's been done by Western intelligence agencies before in trying to threaten Russia with an understanding of what Russia's been planning. And this coming at a time when Radakin is visiting Beijing. There's too many coincidences coming together here.
Yeah, I mean, my thought exactly was the link back into China's possible intentions against Taiwan in the not too distant future, even if they don't intend to supply tens of thousands of their own troops to fight with Russia against Ukraine. I think you make a very, very interesting point about the need for them to get combat experience. And this is something with their no limits friendship, which they always talk about, China and Russia, that Russia can provide them with. Really interesting, and as you say, very worrying, Philip.
Well, it is worrying, and what it's doing is it's bringing together this axis of evil, or the CRINC countries more because we had Trump when he was talking to Putin, turning around to Putin and saying, "Do not give the Iranians a weapon that could destroy Israel." In his phone conversation, everyone concentrated on what he was talking about with Ukraine, but that seemed to slip through, and we've got this increasing relationship that there is between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, because North Korea is now supplying Ukraine about 80% of all of its ammunition. Um,
Right?
uh, 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 did I say supplying Russia about 80% of all its ammunition
Mm,
because
mm.
Russia's defense industrial base is not up to manufacturing what it is that they need, and they're now starting to supply some of the heavy equipment. I've seen heavy artillery pieces, North Korean artillery pieces going forward into the Russian front lines.
If I
But
could say,
that's interesting that the Russian defense industrial base can't keep up. But this relationship is a very worrying relationship.
if I could just say one final thing on that, a lot of observers, including the former foreign minister who I worked for, going back about 2 months, have suggested that what Trump may be trying to do is what's been called a reverse Kissinger, i.e., to drive a wedge between Russia and China. I think I think that may well be part of what Trump is up to, but I think you and I, Philip, would think that that's not going to go very well for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think he is trying to do that. And again, if you look at the language and read between the lines of everything that he's doing, part of the reason why he's trying to disengage from Ukraine is to disengage from Europe, but that's so that he can focus on A, what's going on in the Middle East, because he sees that as an immediate issue and deal with that, but B, prepare for what could be coming in Southeast Asia and China, which is um, uh, the United States' bigger priority. And there's been talk of taking troops out of Taiwan, out of South Korea, and moving them into Taiwan. We've had only today the reports in the newspapers about the deal that the Americans have done to remilitarize with US troops the Panama Canal, and the deal to take over what were two ports, one at either end of the canal, that have been owned by a Chinese registered company. And we're seeing, of course, the massive trade tariffs that are being put against China. And to me, this is, it's attacking China's Belt and Road Initiative that they've got away with for far too long, and they've taken over huge swathes of the world. So I think Donald Trump is doing a good thing with regard to this. But there's a real potential here that this is a 1940, 1941 Japan moment where there's so much economic pressure is going to be put on China that they will have to do something militarily. The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. The Chinese will take Taiwan, I think.
Yeah, my final thoughts on that, and I think you know where I come from when it comes to Donald Trump. I think strategically, Trump is illiterate. And I think, he's clearly putting a huge amount of effort into developing a close relationship with Russia while distancing himself from Europe and ridiculous comments like the EU was set up to screw America and some of the things that JD Vance has said. I think actually Donald Trump, would be far better served, and America would be far better served with doubling down on
Hmm.
its transatlantic relationship with us in Europe, not just
Yeah,
the EU, obviously Britain as well, and because Russia hates the United States. They have no
yeah,
respect. Putin has no respect for Donald Trump. It's
yeah,
only arrogance and hubris that prevents
yeah,
Donald Trump seeing this. I mean, if
yeah,
I, it won't happen. But if I had one piece of advice to give Donald Trump, and it wouldn't even be out of self-interest, it would be, forget about Russia, double down on your, double down with your old friends in Europe, because in the long term, it's
yeah.
going to serve you much better. But I'm afraid he won't.
Well, I don't think it will, but I don't like Trump at all, and I don't want to defend him, but almost in his defense, Europe has been playing America for years by um, you know pretending the guarantees and up and spending the amount of money on defense that they should be doing to protect themselves. And Donald and they've been spending that money on developing their wider trade, and that trade has, in some ways, you look at Ireland, for example, has set up the favorable tax conditions for US companies to headquarters themselves there so that they're not paying the taxes in the United States. And Trump's a businessman. That's and the same with the pharmaceutical industry, the same with other industries. And this is where Trump's just approaching it from a black and white perspective. But when you analyze the shades of grey that there are around it, Europe has played the United States for a long, long time. And Trump is now forcing Europe to step up and to start to deal with things from a defense perspective. And with three major conflicts brewing around the world, I think it's unfair to ask the United States to try and protect us from all three. And he's setting the conditions, whether it be by accident for us to have to deal with the one in Europe so that the Americans can deal with Southeast Asia and we all deal with the Middle East. But again, in the Middle East, we're seeing the United States, we're seeing UK supporting the United States with a lot of military action and everything else, but we're not seeing the other European nations stepping up and dealing with it.